Alright guys, today we're going to learn about a diagram called a cladogram. This is in chapter 18, section 2 of your textbook, and there is a Power Notes sheet. Make sure you have this. This is what it looks like. Has a flow chart for phylogenies, has a cladogram that you can write on down at the bottom. So you want to make sure that you have that. If you don't, go ahead and pause this video, grab what you need, and then come right back. Okay, so we're talking about cladistics, which is also known as phylogeny, and this is basically just the evolutionary history for a group of species. We can get this evidence from studying living things, we can study fossils, we can look at molecular data, which would be amino acid sequences, DNA sequences, things like that. And the way that we show how things are related is this kind of a diagram right here, which is kind of like a tree branch. It's called a cladogram. So this is showing us how species A, B, C, and D all relate to each other in terms of their evolutionary history. We always put the species at the tips of the branches across the top here, and the ancestor for all of these species would be at the bottom. Generally speaking, we read time vertically. This would be ancient time, this would be an ancestor. It could very well be extinct today. And then the closer you get up to the top, the closer you are to modern time. Any branch that ends all the way at the top means that whatever species is at the tip of that branch is still alive today. The last piece of information that you're going to find on a cladogram is the numbers. These hash marks here, the lines, show you when different traits have arisen over time in these groups of species. So remembering again that ancient time is at the very bottom, when trait number 1 first came about, it was before any of these other species branched off. So A, B, C, and D will all share trait number 1, whatever that may be. But look at trait number 2. It comes about after this branch that leads to A. So A does not have trait number 2. B, C, and D, however, all have that same trait. When a trait appears, it continues up throughout the rest of the tree. So now let's talk about the term clade, because really what a cladogram is, it's showing you different clades of organisms and how one clade is found within a larger clade within a larger clade. So what I mean by clade is the species that are all most closely related. If we pick an ancestor, for instance, this ancestor at this point on the chart, all of the descendants from that ancestor, which are the ferns, the conifers, and the flowers, they all make up one clade that branched off from this point. One way you could think about it is if you took a pair of scissors and you cut the cladogram right here, all of the branches that fall off are the part of the same clade. Now, could we say that conifers and flowers make up their own clade? Sure, if we snip our tree right here, then the conifers and flowers would be the clade that we're cutting off. So whatever clade we're looking at, we have to define what clade it is. And do we want a really specific clade, like just the conifers and flowers, or do we want to expand it and include a few more things? So let's revisit what you have on your Power Notes right now. I want to make sure that I explain this to you guys. So you have a diagram at the bottom where you can define clade, and then it has species A, B, C, and D on it. Now in our plant example, we actually had 5 species. It's telling you at the bottom that we can just ignore the algae, because algae aren't really true plants. If we put algae on here, we could technically maybe draw it out here, and we could include algae this way if we wanted to, but we don't really need to do that. We can get the point across just by looking at the other plants. So the other plants are, if we refresh our memory, that will be the mosses, ferns, conifers, and flowers. So I'm going to just go ahead and write that in there. The mosses, ferns, conifers, and flowers. So now we know a little bit more than just A, B, C, and D. So in this diagram, we're trying to figure out how these things relate to each other. We already said that conifers and flowers could be a clade together. This will be the clade based on whatever this ancestor is. If we snip our tree right here, that's our one clade. So let's go back and take a look at this diagram again. We don't have any information about the shared traits right now, but the thing that all of these things have in common, the algae, mosses, ferns, conifers, and flowers, they are all photosynthetic. So that's why they all ended up on this same cladogram here. If we add the next distinguishing feature, this that we just added, this is a derived trait. The cuticle is just a protective coating. Basically, it allows this organism, mosses and ferns, conifers, flowers, it allows them to live on land without drying out. So that was a really important trait that had to evolve before we could have land-dwelling plants. So over on your power notes here, the ancestral trait for all of these land plants is going to be the cuticle. And ancestral trait defined is simply going to be a trait all species share. So again, if we're ignoring our algae here and we're only looking at mosses, ferns, conifers, and flowers, all of those species share this ancestral trait of having a cuticle. So you'll see that the next one that we're defining is a derived trait. So if we go back and take a look at the next trait is vascular tissue. Vascular tissue is kind of like in an animal how we have blood vessels. Well, in plants, they have vascular tissue to move water and nutrients up and down the stem. So notice that this trait of vascular tissue came about at the same time that we have circled this clade here. So we define the clade of ferns, conifers, and flowers based on the fact that they all have vascular tissue. They all came from an ancestor with vascular tissue. So our first derived trait is vascular tissue. And this is going to be a trait that appears in some species. It wasn't there at the beginning, but it is there now. Okay? So if we go back, our next thing that appears is going to be seeds. Feel free to write that in on your power note sheet here. That's going to correspond here. Seeds, meaning everything from this point on has seeds. Oh, I just wrote that in the wrong place. Just kidding. Not there. We already labeled that one vascular tissue. Here is going to be seeds. Okay, so conifers and flowers both have seeds. Ferns do not. Okay, and then the last thing is going to be what makes the flowering plants different. You can probably guess. They actually have flowers. So it's not on here, but if you want to add that, flowers would go here. Okay, now this idea of a node is going to be an ancestor. And this is going to be a common ancestor of conifers and flowers. And just change that. Forgot an M in common. So nodes, which is the branch point, represent ancestors. Okay? So here we are just defining some of those things that we just talked about. The derived trait being a trait that is found in members of a clade but was not present in the ancestor. So remember in our plant example, all of the derived traits were things that came about later in that cladogram. If you want an animal example, we have here on the screen tetrapod ancestors of mammals did not have fur, but mammals, such as the critters you see at the bottom of the screen here, they all do have some type of hair or fur. So we say that's a shared derived trait for all mammals. Okay, so now we're looking at another example of a cladogram here, and this just shows you how we can define different clades based on how broad we want our categories to be. We again have a discussion of the node, which is going to be anywhere we have a branch point. That node is an ancestor, and some descendants of that ancestor became elephants, for example, and then the other descendants of this ancestor went on to become other types of organisms. So you'll notice that the species that are more closely related tend to share more derived characters with each other because they are more similar to each other. And then again, we have our definition of the ancestral trait is a trait that was present in the ancestor, so every single thing in your cladogram would have that trait. In this example here, our ancestral trait is 4 limbs with digits. If you look at all of those organisms, they are all 4-limbed organisms, and they have digits or finger bones. So one thing that can be confusing about a cladogram is how to read it from the bottom up as opposed to from left to right. When we look at this cladogram here, we can see a fish, a frog, a lizard, a goose, a cat, and a human. And we may think, okay, this order makes sense. Fish are very different from humans, and as you get closer to the human, you're getting more similar. But I want to caution you against reading left to right. It's all about when did you share a common ancestor. So this would be a common ancestor between a cat and a human. This would be the common ancestor between the lizard and the goose, and so on and so forth. So you can actually rotate around those nodes. So it is just as correct for us to position the human to the left of the cat as it was for the human to be to the right of the cat. And so you actually have a place for this. If we look at the next page of your Power Notes here, you have this cladogram given. You can draw if you want, or you can just write. This can certainly say human, cat, so we can rotate it that way. We could also think about rotating it at an even deeper node. So what if we rotated here, and then you have the human and the cat, the lizard and the goose in a different place. So let's go back over here and see, is that acceptable? Well, yes, it is. You can rotate this node as well. This cladogram is still showing the exact same relationship as it was initially. So when I say read the cladogram from the ground up, that really just means look at the nodes. Look at when the nodes separate one type of species from another. So this is a good way to think about it. The red node here, shown by this red arrow, shows a split between species A and the entire clade of everything else. That node is in the same position in both of these trees. We look at the blue node, same thing. That shows the split between BFC, which is one clade, and DE. And then if we go up to the green node, it shows the split between species B and clade FC. All 3 of those nodes are in the same order on both of those trees. So both of those trees are showing the exact same relationship. And then finally, as we are thinking about our evidence, remember that molecular evidence, looking at sequence data, that is going to be kind of the gold standard or the final word in terms of is something related to something else. So I'm actually going to stop here, and we're going to talk about how to create a cladogram in another video.